Well, I mean, one of the things I wanted to kind of, challenge Angie on is there are 8 billion people on this planet. I want you to think about that. There are 8 billion people on this planet. There are 1.2 billion black people on this planet. There are about 425 million people in the US. Finding someone should not be this difficult or this hard. I find it rather difficult and rather challenging to kind of concur to this milestone that's saying like everybody's not going to get aligned. I think people don't want to be aligned. You know what I'm saying? And the reality of the matter is to kind of take some of the perspective that JR has laid out. Our society is not designed for 50 and 60-year-old plus bachelors and bachelorettes. It's just not. Name me a society in history, going back as far as you want to go, where there's a society that predominantly focused on having a society full of bachelors and bachelorettes. It's just not. Our society is just not designed that way. You know what I'm saying? And unfortunately, today we've made it seem like that it is possible. In reality, it's not. Go ahead, Clout.
So what you just asked is kind of in your question, right? Um, like you said, 8 billion people in the world, right? The principles now we got to remember that marriage is an economy, right? Marriage is an economy, and currently we live in a post-marriage economy. What do I mean by that? People needed to get married at a point because they needed more people in order for the society to function. So people had to get married, people had to have children, people had in order for in order to populate. That's no longer a problem in the times we live in now. Our world is very populated with humans, right? And because our world is very populated with humans, the end goal now is no longer procreation like it once was, because we don't really need more people. We're actually in some places we actually don't even have the resources for more people, right? And so marriage is not as advantageous for anybody as it was in the past, and the incentives are gone. For example, women didn't work at one point, and now women do work. So there are women who needed to get married for stability at one point. They needed to. They didn't have access to a job. They didn't have access to income. So in order to survive, they had to couple with someone. That's not the case anymore. When a woman can very happily live until she's 90 in her apartment with her plants and her cats, and live quite comfortably with a small community of her friends. And the same with guys. Also, sex is a lot more easy to attain than it's more easier to attain than it's ever been. People were marrying at a time because the ideal was, well, okay, if I can get consistent sex from you, then I'm willing to make this commitment to not have sex with anybody else, because that's advantageous for them. And the reason why is because sex was so hard to come by in a past time. You might have traveled miles through different villages on horse and not seen a woman in most of those villages, a woman that was viable, right? That wasn't married. That's not the case. There's women everywhere. There's men everywhere. There is no lack of sex. There is no lack of sexual gratification. There's no lack of men's eyes being able to see a woman's body, and vice versa. So we've all been the people who are still on those ideals usually are Christians, right? Because a lot of us are raised as Christians, and so we have these ideals. But I think that what Christians miss is that the rest of the world doesn't have those ideals, and that the rest of the world isn't Christian. And because the rest of the world isn't Christian, it's provided new options for people, right?
Say
When the
that
whole
shit.
world is Christian and all your neighbors are Christian, and you don't show up to church on Sunday, guess what? You're ostracized. Well, what do you mean you're not coming to church? Everybody's at church. But that's not the society we live in no more. People ain't going to church on Sunday. People doing whatever they want on Sunday. Like, we don't live in a society where Friday night when the sun goes down, everybody's in their house. That's not where we live anymore. So we're trying to apply these metrics or these rules to a world that we no longer live in, and that's why people aren't following through with it. The reason why people are jumping around so much is because they're trying to survive in this world. And in this world, it's easier to get a new partner than it is to stick with an old one. It's just a fact. So there's so many changes in the world that we live in that I think make it almost impossible for marriage to work the way it did before. And I think that's why you have so many women who are like, you know what? I might as well just date around, because guess what? She might marry a guy. Again, guys aren't making all the bread no more neither. So she might marry a guy and not live the life she imagined, but she might date and jump around from this rapper to this dude and feel like she's living the life that she wants to live, which is obviously the case with Melissa Ford. Now, obviously, in hindsight, when you get old and you no longer have the options, then you start thinking back to the traditional. But we're not living in a traditional world. So the traditional behaviors are not working for people. People are just trying to cope with the fact that this world has changed and just trying to get what they can where they can get it. And that's what I really think it is.
Wouldn't you say that the Western world has changed? Because I think a lot of these values and ideals still exist in other parts of the world. You know what I'm saying? I think we're kind of have this clash of the titans where we're talking about the world in which we live and operate, work, and do business, versus other worlds, meaning other countries, other parts of the world where they operate differently, where they view community, family, legacy, etc., way different than how we view it or how we might perceive it. So I think that this side of the world is trying to do a campaign promotion to spread that across the world and kind of push this narrative. And I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to hold that line from that kind of passing on. So you see a lot of countries that are banning certain things in propaganda, etc., because they're trying to preserve, family, community, etc., and they don't want to become what we are here in the States. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is the playground where this happens, right? And what I'm saying, over here is a completely different world where certain values, virtues are held. So,
which is fair, right? But usually those places where they have those values are places that are underdeveloped. Like the places where they still have the traditional values are usually not as developed as it is here. So I feel like that makes a difference. They have a need to get together, to get married, to build these families, whereas Americans really don't. I mean, not
Yeah.
just that, I think also we also overlook the damage that has been done to people by marriage and by traditional families. Like, again, there are a lot of great traditional families out there, and there are a lot of great marriages out there. But for every good example of a marriage and every good example of a nuclear family, there's a bad example of a nuclear family. There are several nuclear families where the father was beating on the kids, beating on the wife. There are several nuclear families where both parents were alcoholics and on drugs. I mean, I live in a somewhat suburban neighborhood, right? But if I go over to the next town, and the next town is mostly white, but I have a lot of white friends in those neighborhoods, and a lot of them have broken. I'm talking about really broken families. Like, sure, their parents are married, but like, there's no love in those houses. And I think that when you quantify and you add up all of those examples of people who have had families and they have terrible relationships with their families, and they have terrible relationships with their mother and their father, and the mother and father been divorced, and all the chaotic things that come with it, I think particularly for America, people are just not into it anymore. It's no longer seen as a foolproof answer to have success. It's actually hurt a lot of people. And I feel like we don't acknowledge that when we have the conversation about marriage, because marriage is romanticized. When we think of marriage, we think of all the feelings that come along with it. We think of that walking down the aisle and singing the songs and holding hands and the love. But we don't think about what happens after that. We don't think about we don't think about that woman who's with that guy who doesn't have a good job and isn't paying all the bills, and she feels trapped and stressed. We're not talking about that man who's with that woman who's not giving him sex and he feels trapped. We also don't deal with the fact that, a lot of times when people get married, passion is gone because the relationship becomes familial. That's something that's also talked about in Esther Vilar's book. Passion is lost in marriages often because once the man becomes a provider, he becomes like a father to a woman. And once a man views a woman that he's with from a father perspective, attraction's lost. And that's why a lot of men step out and cheat, because they're looking for that passion. And where does the passion come from? The passion is going to come from someone that they don't have to take care of. It's going to come from someone who lives their own life. This is why when you find men cheating, who are they cheating with? The mistress archetype, the woman who does what she wants, lives by her own rules, but they're cheating on the wife at home, right? That's because obviously traditional marriage doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't serve all of the needs. And it's like, we have to acknowledge that. Until we acknowledge that traditional marriage doesn't serve all the needs that people have, then we're never going to understand why it's failing.